Hi, my name is Levi John Wolf, and today we'll be talking a little bit about counterfactual thinking, or what I call the logic of causation. We'll be talking about counterfactual thinking because it's core to understanding how causality works in science. So, we'll divide this into three topics. First, we'll talk a little bit about what is a counterfactual. Second, we'll talk a little bit about why you should care about counterfactuals. And third, we'll talk a little bit about strategies for you to adopt counterfactual thinking in your own work. Starting off with what is a counterfactual, the short answer is they are what if X happens scenarios. And we use them to discover a concept of causation called but for X causation. And I'll make this clear in a second. We'll be working primarily from material from the Book of Why, The New Science of Cause and Effect by Judea. This book was on your suggested reading for the topic, and in it there are a couple of great quotes. To start off, I'd like this quote. In Statistics 1, or Geographic Methods 1, every student learns to chant, correlation is not causation. And this is with good reason. Unfortunately, this tells us that correlation is not causation, but it does not tell us what causation is. You see, this is the problem with a negative definition. If all we give you is that correlation is not something else, if A is not B, I'm never actually defining A. I'm never actually defining B. I'm just telling you that two things are distinct. So Pearl and Mackenzie write a lot about how statistics, at least the classical notion that arose in the 20th century, has kind of failed to seriously grapple with the notion of causality. At least until, of course, Judea came around and solved it. There's a bit of grandstanding in the reading you'll have to take with a grain of salt, but by and large, he's not wrong. So, with this, Judea kind of main contribution is about counterfactual thinking and how counterfactuals can help you understand processes. So, working with his definition, a counterfactual allows us to characterize what happens in a scenario that is not directly observed. So counterfactual derives from, opposite or not actually what happened. Factual occurrences are things that happened, and counterfactual occurrences are things that could have happened but did not. Counterfactual. So it allows us to characterize what happens in a scenario that we don't observe. And counterfactuals kind of come in two flavors. One of them is kind of like a statement, a noun, where a counterfactual statement is a statement about what would have happened. In contrast, a scenario, a counterfactual, could be thought of as an alternative present where the past has been changed. And it is this sense, which I'll kind of explain a little bit more in a second, and that we'll use primarily to analyze our thoughts about processes in geography. The way that I'd like you to think about this, and the way that should appear in every single section of your criticism or self-reflection of any assignment going forward, of any modeling, of any physical or human or whatever, if things had gone differently, would my outcome have been different? If I had done my study differently, then I might have this specific difference in findings. And I'll show you how to do this in a second. So an example of how to think about this is using a movie called Sliding Doors. And in this movie, it's kind of like Run, Lola, Run, or Lola Rent, if you've ever seen that movie. In this movie, Gwyneth Paltrow tries to catch a tube at Waterloo. And in one kind of version of the narrative, she misses her train. And in the other version of the narrative, she actually catches her train. And through all of the kind of spiraling different chains of events that happen, when she catches that train, she ends up dying. She ends up meeting someone, having a big kind of sort of relationship gone wrong and then gone good again and then back and forth. And then she ends up, I think, getting in a car accident and then dying. And if she doesn't catch the train, she lives. So it's kind of an exploration of how one little change in your life can result in very different outcomes. Now, this is perfect for thinking about counterfactual thinking. We observe some outcome. Y here stands for outcome. It's just how I'm spelling outcome. It's a lot shorter and a lot easier to say, so I'm using it here. We also observe some conditions under which that outcome arises. And here I'm spelling conditions with X. So I'm just substituting these in. It's no math, just symbolic representation. Okay? We'd like to make statements about how likely it is that our outcome Y happens, given that we saw X, some conditions. Okay? So, in our example, this means that we'd like to make statements about how likely an outcome is given that we saw some conditions. And the way that's spelled in mathematical terms is sort of the probability of some outcome Y. So the P stands for the probability. And then the brackets tell us that we're talking about the probability of a particular event. Y is our outcome happening. And X is our conditions under which that outcome arose. So we'd like to make statements about the probability of our outcome given, that vertical line means given, the conditions under which it happened. So that vertical line means the thing on the left given the thing on the right happened. Okay? So if we were thinking about this in terms of Gwyneth Paltrow, we would be thinking about how likely it is that she dies given that she succeeds. Well, it's a really convoluted chain of events, so it's probably not that likely. But we can never really assess that probability analytically. Now, another way that you can think about this is that if something slightly different happens, there might be a different outcome. And here I'm using that little tick, that little apostrophe, next to my outcome and my conditions to stand for something different happened. So if I say X is she catches the train and Y is she dies, then X tick, or sometimes called X prime, means that she fails to catch the train. And Y tick, or Y prime, means that she lives. So we have when she succeeds, she dies. And we have when she fails, she lives. And the likelihood of these outcomes given the conditions is really hard to know. But in statistical modeling, we're oftentimes interested in predicting these kinds of things. How likely is it that Gwyneth Paltrow will live given that she failed to catch her train? That's a very complicated statistical inference. Probably a lot of non-random processes going on there as well as random processes, but you get my drift. For our purposes, it's important to realize that neither Gwen can know how the other Gwen turned out. So in the version where she's lying on her deathbed, having caught the train at Waterloo and met this guy and had this whole experience, she can't know what would be different if she had not caught the train, putting aside that it's probably unlikely that she even knows that that's the branching point for her two futures. So the point here is that we only live in one reality. And we actually can't know for certain how our current reality would be different if different things happened in the past. But we can come up with a really good guess. And that is counterfactual inference. So the way that we denote a counterfactual statement, the way that we spell it, is like this. If I'm the Gwen that lived, and I knew that I didn't catch the tube and that I'm definitely alive, then I could say, would I be alive still if I had caught the tube that day? The way that we spell that is y subscript x. So y, if this x had happened, given that that x did not happen, x prime, and that I'm definitely alive, y prime. Does that make sense? From this Gwen's perspective, she didn't catch the train, and she lived. The statement above in the center of the screen here is asking, if I had caught the train, would I still be alive? Y underscore X, or Y underset X. Okay? That is a counterfactual inference. Would I be alive still if I had caught the tube that day, given that I didn't catch the tube and I'm still alive? Okay, so it's a statement about an alternative present, given that the past is different. So who cares about these things? They seem like very academic, conceptual, theoretical claims. Well, you should care, because they're fundamental to how humans think about causality. And it goes all the way back to Hume, one of the most famous philosophers on the theory of causation. So moving forward here, Judea Pearl and Dana Mackenzie provide us with this useful quote. It's one thing to say that smoking causes cancer, but it's another thing to say that my Uncle Joe, who smoked a pack a day for 30 years, would have been alive had he not smoked. The difference is both obvious and profound. None of the people who, like Uncle Joe, smoked for 30 years and died can ever be observed in the alternate world where they did not smoke for 30 years. What this is saying is that you can say abstractly that X causes Y, but if X happens, you can actually never roll Y back to a state where X didn't happen. If my Uncle Joe had not smoked, he would have not gotten cancer. That is a counterfactual statement. If not X had occurred, then maybe not Y would have occurred. So you see here, smoking causes cancer is an abstract causal statement. The but for X form that Pearl and Mackenzie talk about is would have been alive had he not smoked. If it wasn't for Joe smoking, he would be alive. That is a but for X causation. If I go back in time and I just make Joe not smoke, I make him go cold turkey, stop, quit smoking now, he would have been alive. That's a claim that but for smoking, Joe would be alive. And that sense of causality is the only stable sense of causality, according to Pearl and Mackenzie, and it's the one that you should always chase when you're attempting to demonstrate a causal effect. Okay? So every time you think about causality and every time you're trying to prove that something causes something else, you need to be able to demonstrate it in terms of this but for X method. And we'll talk a little bit about ways to do that in methods that you're going to learn throughout your degree. And this applies across human and physical geography. So the way that this is explained in the Pearl and Mackenzie book is with this ladder of causation. And I think it's a little important to talk about this now. When we talk about causation, we can say that the first level of understanding is seeing something. X happens and Y is the result. So, is Gwen alive when she misses her train? And another way that we can think about it is, do unequal societies have cities with really different sizes? So in an unequal society, do we have really big cities and really small cities? Or is there about even population across our cities. This is just a seeing kind of thing. We know that some outcome happens, and we know the conditions under which that outcome arose. So you can see here that we spell these claims about the present in terms of this representation, just like we saw before. When we make a model of whether or not unequal societies have cities with really different sizes, we have an outcome y that we have observed, and we have conditions x that we also have observed. And we're trying to characterize the probability of y happening given that we've seen x already. We have no other information. Then there's a level of understanding that is about intervention, and Pearl calls this doing. This is a predictive relationship between cause and effect. This means that I'm going to change the circumstance in the future. So one might think of this, if Gwen catches the train from now on, will she live? If I go and do that X, will Y obtain? If I reduce inequality in society, will cities start to become the same size? That's another way of thinking about that counterfactual statement. Well, it's not a counterfactual yet, it's just a do statement. If I go out and change X, will Y have a change? What's the probability that Y will change? So that's a doing statement, and that's the second level on the ladder of causation. The third and the most important or powerful version is what Pearl calls imagining, which is the counterfactual level of the ladder. This is a predictive relationship between an alternative cause and effect, and this is what we were talking about in terms of an alternative present. If Gwen had caught the train, would she still be alive today? If I went back in time and played the tape with a different note, do I still get the same song? If society had not been so unequal, would city size have converged? That's another way of thinking about that statement. If I go back in time and change things, then would my present be different? And this is a little bit subtly different from the doing, because the doing is about an alternative future, whereas a counterfactual is about an alternative present. If I had changed one thing, given that that didn't actually happen, would my outcome be any different? That is a counterfactual statement. It's an imagining process. And Pearl talks a lot about why you move from seeing to doing to imagining in our sophisticated understandings of processes. And some people ask, why focus on imagining things? Why focus on this imaginative element in science? If things had been different, if conditions had been different, then this alternative outcome would result. Why do we focus on that? Well, if we have a model that can answer these counterfactual questions, we can also answer all the other things. If we know that counterfactual claim, if Gwen had caught the train, would she have lived anyway? We can certainly model, in the future, if Gwen catches the train, will she live? We can totally do that because the future conditions are just the same as right now, and we change one little bit about X. If we know the counterfactual, if we know the alternative present, we can usually answer the alternative future. We can usually make predictions about how things would be different. When we set the conditions for the counterfactual, we just set them to right now. We don't deal with the fact that the past has effects on our present. Since we're currently in tomorrow's yesterday, all we have to do is set the model to today. I know that that's a little bit mind-bending, but it's kind of the best way to think about it. Since we know that tomorrow, well, we're yesterday's tomorrow. We just set the conditions for now, and we run the model forward. And this happens in any kind of modeling or thinking. When we can make counterfactual statements, then we can definitely also make associative or seeing statements, because we can answer the observation directly. We just know immediately that X and Y have happened, or not X and not Y. So the observational conditions are always the grounds for the counterfactuals that we make. We have to know what did happen in order to answer what could have happened. So this is all very, very abstract, and I can appreciate that it just seems like pie in the sky, imagining stuff. I get it. It sounds bullshit. let me give you some strategies for how this actually matters in your life. Causality is about theory. So you have to really think about the theory of how things relate before you start fitting models or running simulations, or indeed, even thinking about sort of the hermeneutics of a process. There are two ways that really matter for using counterfactual thinking in your scholarship. And I'm calling them here a heuristic and an analytic strategy. A heuristic is kind of like a rough rule that helps you get the right result, although it may not always be, completely correct. And analytic here, I just mean like a way to estimate statistical models in particular. So starting with the heuristic, I'm talking about using counterfactual thinking to make your assumptions about a process clear. And this is much more of a way for you to improve your own thinking than it is about any sort of statistical modeling. So let's look at a claim about causation. Asthma is caused by exposure to air pollution. So this is like Pearl's statement about smoking causes cancer. Here we're making a claim, asthma is caused by exposure to air pollution. And the nice little heuristic is to make what we call a causal diagram. And a causal diagram is supposed to list all of the possible effects, all of the possible causes that lead to an effect. So here our causal statement is asthma is caused by exposure to air pollution. So we might say that if we have an exposure to air pollution, we get asthma with some, probability. Maybe not everybody who gets exposed gets asthma, but some probability that exposure to air pollution then causes you to get asthma. This is a very, very basic causal diagram. But anytime you're trying to think about a process or an outcome that you want to study, draw one of these things because they get pretty complex pretty quickly. Imagine that in our data or in our analysis, we only have this information. We have sort of the PM 2.5 concentration at, say, the local authority or local super output area, and we have the number of asthma cases per 1,000 people. And that's it. That's all the data that we have. And even in qualitative studies, you still have data, right? You still have sort of empirical discussions of things that people have said or, text or experience. You still have this kind of thing, how you're measuring or representing a process. It doesn't have to be numeric, but it's still a representation. And you've seen this before elsewhere in this course. So here I'm just talking about quantitative stuff because it's easier, but it's not the only way that this happens. And again, this also happens across physical and human geography in any process. So if exposure causes asthma, and this is how I'm measuring it, this is then giving me tools to think about ways I might be wrong. So if my exposure had been different, how might asthma be different? So it gives you an engine to say, okay, how might my exposure actually be different? If exposure causes asthma, are there any places that would prove me wrong? Are there any places with the same exposure but different asthma rates? If so, why would they be different? That's the power. It gives you a really precise way to think about the ways in which your representations can be wrong. If exposure causes asthma, two places with the same exposure to air pollution should have about the same number of asthma cases. And if there's a difference, I need to understand how that difference arises. So what are some ways why those differences would arise? Well, PM 2.5 may not be the only pollutant that matters, right? I might need to think about other pollutants. An LSOA, which is just an area, just a container, may not accurately represent my exposure to pollution. A cyclist that commutes daily from a clean location through a dirty area, they're exposed on their ride daily, and they're not exposed where they live. Now, this is kind of, silly given what's not going on, but commuting is a big difference in how people experience the city. A second thing is that a builder on a construction site might be exposed at their workplace, regardless of whether or not the atmospheric pollution is high or low. So if I have two places and there's a high concentration of, say, manual laborers, builders in one of those places, then my asthma rates might be higher there, because my one variable, exposure, is not a complete representation of all of the things that drive asthma. So the things I've been talking a little bit about are something called mediating variables in sort of thinking about these processes. You won't need to know that. But what you do need to know is that I need to think about this counterfactually. If things had been different, if I have two very similar places, or if I have two very different places, are there any other things that would drive the outcome of asthma? I need to use that counterfactual to assess my understanding of a process. So I have some other processes here, but the way that I'd like you to remember it is that if my theory is true, what's the information that would prove me wrong? I'm kind of taking the theory and then trying to backtrack into things that might not fit that theory. And that's counterfactual. That's sort of saying that there's this experience or this statement about reality. And then if that statement would have been different, if there were these different little things that happened before my theory of causation, does my theory of causation still hold? So it gives you kind of like an inductive way to proceed. And then it gives you a diagram to store those deductive things. So again, we've talked about our theory that maybe air pollution causes asthma. And then I've talked a little bit about what exposure might mean and how exposure to air pollution might get a little finicky. Now, an example of refining this causal diagram might look at this exposure process. Does it matter for wealth? Does it matter the intensity? Does it matter the variety of pollutants? And then I might come up with alternative routes for how air pollution causes asthma. And this is really where the counterfactual thinking helps you get ahead. When I make a process diagram like this, I'm telling you different stories for how effects relate to one another. So air pollution exists, and it has varying intensities from a day-to-day, month-to-month basis. And if I have an intense experience of air pollution, then I might get asthma. Alternatively, one air pollutant might not be enough. So walking down the train to variety, if I have a bunch of different kinds of pollutants, that might also matter. And if I have a bunch of different kinds of pollutants that are also intense, then I might get asthma. So you see, that's kind of a causal pathway. Air pollution that's both varied and intense may cause asthma. However, air pollution that's just intense and is just one particular kind of pollutant may not necessarily. Pollutants might have different effects, etc., etc. The other thing that might happen is that your wealth can affect both the variety and intensity of the air pollution you experience. Further, there might be a genetic component to your experience of air pollution. Now, if I am exposed to air pollution and I have a genetic predisposition to asthma, that might actually then result in asthma. Of course, if I have a genetic predisposition, there will also be generally preventative treatment. But preventative treatment depends again on wealth, going back down the model. So this allows us to sketch out all the different things that we think cause our outcome. And also, it allows us to identify how those things are related. And thinking about models of reality in this, what they call a directed acyclic graph, allows you to really powerfully represent how cause and effect are related. So, moving on, just focusing on one pathway, this kind of effect of wealth and air pollution exposure mix together to result in different causal pathways. What this should indicate here is that the effect of air pollution on asthma is going to be really hard to separate from wealth. They're two confounding variables. They both affect all these little bits of the process that then filter down to our outcome, asthma. So if we're interested in estimating the effect of air pollution on asthma incidence, we need to consider wealth. We might not need to consider these indirect variables that filter and mix the effects of wealth and air pollution. And there are ways in which, if you read the book further, that you'll understand how to do this. But the main point is that as a conceptual organizing way, we can look at the interaction of these indirect sort of varied exposure pathways and model them if we need to. This representation is a conceptual model, no statistics involved. We can get there, just like in a simulation in physical sciences. We'll have all these different effects coming together that then reduce into an outcome. In a social scientific sense, we can have this as well. And in a conceptual sense, you can think about this as a way to model sort of intersectionality or complex high-dimensional interacting facets of a process. Now, from a statistical sense, you might not be able to understand the different impacts of these effects together. So standard regression techniques might not get you to where you need to go, but at least you'll know that. At least you'll be aware, if you make a diagram like this, when regression can work and when it can't, and when you might need to think of something else. So, as a conceptual organizing tool, that works really well. And you can think of it in terms of indirect and direct effects. Do causes interact or interfere? If I draw one of those causal diagrams, which again, if you do the reading, there'll be a discussion of how to draw those diagrams, but you're basically just drawing links between all the factors and the outcomes at hand that you think affect one another. Pearl uses this term, listens to one another. When an effect listens to something, you draw an arrow from the thing that starts it to the thing that is listening to it. And again, that'll be discussed extensively in the reading. So I want to give you this sort of softer way, this heuristic. If this is true, then what would prove me wrong? That sort of backwards thinking about counterfactuals. If this thing, then these other things. And then an analytic way to encode this thinking in terms of a graph or a series of lines that tells you what factors listen to what other factors. With these two things, you can seriously level up your science. And it'll really help you conceptually to map the way your processes work. Causal diagrams are great tools to clarify the theory of what's going on, and they're naturally counterfactual. They lead immediately to counterfactual thinking. So, in this lecture, I hope we'll have discussed clearly that a counterfactual is a what if X happens scenario, and they help us to make but for X causations. If it wasn't for smoking, Uncle Joe would not have died. Who cares about counterfactuals? Well, you should. They're fundamental to human reasoning about cause and effect, and they have been, arguably, since the 18th century. I've given you two strategies to talk about counterfactual inference. I've given you one really basic one, which is, assuming this theory is true, walk backwards. How might my different X's that maybe I didn't include or didn't experience result in the thing that I see, or result in something different from what I see? Another way that I've told you how to use counterfactuals is by drawing causal diagrams. Take all the things that you think are related to your outcome and connect them up. Which listens to what factor? How do these things interact? Just making that diagram can help you think clearly about what you're analyzing, regardless of the process, human, physical, quantitative, qualitative, does not matter. So, with that, I have the logic of causation, counterfactual thinking. I'll have some office hours later this week, and I'll post the details on Blackboard. I also always have bookable office hours on calendly.com, and I'll post the link there on Blackboard as well. Anyway, thanks a lot for coming today, and I hope to hear from you all soon.